Okay, let's go live on YouTube. Hold on. Okay. We're holding on page Kufid Beis Amid Beis, less than a blot, about a blot, a daf, blot left, a page left. Let's bring up the sheet page. Okay, this is it's a Shver Gemara. It means to say it's not difficult. There's not a lot of mefarshim on it. Long Rashis, longer than usual, and just there's a kind of a certain amount of knowledge on certain things that have to be that help understand this Gemara. We're going to try to keep it at a nice pace, not to explain too much, but it does touch on a lot of ideas. Okay, we're just going to go quickly back to the Gemara. We were talking about what happens in Ir Hanidachas, in the city of idol worship, if there are things that belong to the Beis Hamikdash, Hegdish, called Hegdish. So it says, if there's things that are holy things that are, which are called kache, there's things that are sacrifices that are called kache kachim and kache kalim. Kache kachim are more severe, with limited, a lot of restrictions about where you could eat it, who eats it, when's it eaten, the time it's eaten. So like an oila sacrifice that gets totally consumed. Then you have what's the lighter sacrifices that are kind of parts of it go on the mizbeach, only parts of it go to the kohen, the rest of them go to the person who is giving the carbon, like a Passover lamb, and it can be eaten either, it's not limited to be eaten in the temple, it could be eaten in Jerusalem, etc. So what about sacrifices that are in the city of a city that has an idol worship? What do we do with the sacrifices that have already been designated? We'll see exactly, seemingly to the temple. So kache kedashim v'kache mizbeachim musu, things that have been designated that are holy, or what we would call kache kalim, that are things that are designated for the altar, have to be put to death. V'mayim musu yiru achi yista'avu, let them just at least pasture until they become unqualified, and then you could just and then you could sell them as unqualified sacrifices. Means that once they get a blemish, they no longer could be sacrificed, and therefore you would redeem them with money and use the money for buying other sacrifices. And this way, it kind of washes out that this was involved of an animal that was owned or initially donated by someone who was persecuted and killed in a city of idol worship. So Rabbi Yochanan says Zevach Rishayim Te'eva, that it's an abomination. Even the monies that are kind of being washed and being redeemed, it's still considered its foundation. Why was it sanctified in the first place? Because it was given by a person who's a rasha, who's a sinner, means a person who's part of this city of idol worship, and it's an abomination where you don't want to have anything to do with it or its money or its value. Rish Lakish says it's not about an abomination, but it's more that as long as it's a sacrifice that belongs to someone, that this specific person donated this sacrifice to the temple, so it's called mamon bailim. It's as if it's that person's he or she his or her money, and because we'll see why. So if it's his or her money, so just like his or her money gets destroyed, so it won't get destroyed because it's sacred. But it gets put to death and it can't just be redeemed. And here we're talking about what makes it their money. It's called Kadashim Shechai Bachriosin. In the case where the owner, the donor, the person who's giving this sacrifice is obligated to take responsibility if something happens. And if something were to happen to the sacrifice, that person, he or she, has to again take responsibility to find another animal. So that kind of responsibility makes it their money. Reb Shimon, and this is according to Reb Shimon, that says mamon bailamu, that when you have responsibility for the sacrifice, it's still like your money, and therefore it can't be redeemed because it belongs to a sinner who served an idol. We're not going to do the Rashis. We did the Rashis last week, so therefore it's considered monies that are owned by a person who has to be destroyed. So it doesn't get destroyed like the city because it's sacred, but it gets killed. So the Gemara says it can't be Reb Shimon. Why can't it be Reb Shimon? Because the very fact that Reb Shimon himself in the Brisa disagrees or says a second opinion, we learned last week that Reb Shimon gives his own opinion about what kind of things, what happens to sacred articles in a city. So it means the first part of the Mishnah's price is not Reb Shimon. So how could you say that this is according to Reb Shimon that says that when a person is obligated for the responsibility of the sacred sacrifice, that would make that person still being, it still has the name of that person. It's called Mammon Bailim. So therefore he says that it can't be Reb Shimon. So who is it? Lav Reb Shimon. So Bekachim Kalim. So therefore we're not talking about, yes, if it is sacred sacrifices, so then you could, once it's sacred, meaning it's something that's not eaten at all by the owner, by the donor. It's only either totally consumed on the altar or eaten by the priests only in the temple, etc. There's all the restrictions that we learned last week about the difference between what's called a light sacrifice and a more intense sacrifice. So that if it's an intense sacrifice called kachei kachim, yes, then it could be redeemed. It can't be the same sacrifice because everyone agrees it's an abomination, but it can be redeemed because it totally has no connection to the donor. However, kachim kalim. What about, hey Aaron, what about light sacrifices? Sacrifices that are like something that the donor participates in, the eating, etc. And this goes according to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. The Omer and Rabbi Yossi Haglili says because the person who's giving the sacrifice eats it, etc. So it's kachim kalim, mammon bailim. It means this itself is money of the owner, even though we're not going to sacrifice the sacrifice, we're going to redeem it, but it's his sacrifice or her sacrifice. But total sacrifices that are totally sanctified, more intense, has no the owner has no participation once it's donated, so then it could be redeemed. Okay, again, we will not learn the Rashis and the Rabbi Steinsaltz. We did this last week. This is where we're holding. The reason I'm going over because we ended a mid-conversation. So this Gemara says like this, 1 second. If you're saying that's kachei kachim, that things that have been totally, what's called intense sanctity of a sacrifice, those that have no participation no longer in the donor, it's either consumed totally by the altar or the kohanim eat it. It's called the idea. This is this week's parsha. Kohanim oichlim v'bailim iskaprim. Kind of part of the atonement is by the kohanim eating it. It's not like they're eating it because they're enjoying a shwama. That's part of the atonement process is by the kohanim eating it. So kachei bedek habayis yipadu. The fact that it says in the end of the brisa that if it's donations, right? Someone could donate a cow to the as a sacrifice, but donating the cow as a donation, right? That the so to say the temple could decide to sell the sacrifice and use its money for other things, and then the person who's buying it is supposed to use it as a sacrifice. It doesn't just go out to become a cow to start plowing, but it's given as money or any kind of money's value that you give to the temple to be used as monies for the value for the temple to be used for whatever the upkeep of the temple, right? It's called bedek habayis, the upkeep. So we learned that the upkeep of the liflik listening b'didah. We should have said clearly. When does it get killed? The kalim. Only according to Rabbi Yossi, that something that's considered a light sacrifice, that it's going to be eaten also by the donor. Hey Shuki. So we're on Yud Beis Amid Beis, Kuf Yud Beis Amid Beis, 112 on the second side. So if it's kachei kalim, then it gets killed. Avakachei kedashim yipadu. It should say, but the Mishnah should say, but something that's a kachei kachim, something that's a sacrifice that's sanctified, meaning to say that has no more participation in the giver, the donor, should be able to be redeemed. So why does it say only that bedek habayis, things that are donated to the temple? The temple, obviously, if you take a check and write $100 check, okay, that's something else, the $100 itself. But if you were to give, let's say, a diamond necklace to the temple, and they sell the necklace and they use the monies, so that's washing it out. So the Mishnah says clearly that things that are donated for the upkeep, so we won't keep the thing itself, but we'll sell it and use its value. So why don't we just also say, or at least say something more interesting, which would be that something that's kachei kachim, something that is kadashim, that's something that's a sacrifice, but it's sanctified. It means it has no more connection to once it's donated, it has no more connection physically to the donor, should be able to be redeemed as well for value. So the Gemara says, no, we can't. Why? Because this is, again, when I started off this class, there's a lot of things that we're going to learn now in today's class that are just like casual statements from the Gemara that we need one needs to have background about the laws. And these are one of them. The rule is like this. This has nothing to do with Ir Hanidachas, a city of idol worship. If someone donates a sin sacrifice, and then the donor dies, the sin sacrifice is put to death. You don't redeem the sin sacrifice, and you don't use it for another sacrifice. And it's all the laws when it comes to a sin achatas, a sin sacrifice, that shemesu ba'aleh, that the donor, the person who's given it for their sin, his or her sin, if they die, so what are you going to do with the sacrifice? They're not alive anymore, and it's an atonement for a live person. So what you do is the lemisa azla gets put to death. That's just the rule by any chatas, any sin sacrifice, that before the actual slaughtering of the sacrifice and the sprinkling of the blood, etc., the owner dies, you can't use the sacrifice. So therefore, we couldn't just say a general statement that kache kadashim yipadu, because these people are being put to death. And included in kache kadashim, sanctified sacrifices, is the chatas. That's one of the kache kadashim. So you couldn't just make a blanket statement to say kache kadashim yipadu. Therefore, it says bedek abayis yipadu, based on our explanation that it's according to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili that it's only about kache kalim. So therefore, we know that if it's not a chatas, it could be redeemed. But the Brisa doesn't say it clearly, because by just making a blanket statement, one would think maybe this includes the chatas, and it doesn't. Again, not because the person who's being killed is part of an idol worship city, but because the person who donated is being killed. At the end of the day, if the donor of a sin sacrifices dies, even natural causes, before they sacrifice it, we put to death the sin sacrifice. That's the law. Okay. This is, again, one of the points that I said, that one has to have a little bit of background about the laws of chatas. So let's see the Rashis. The Brisa says that the difference is that kachim mizbeach, those that are sanctified for the altar, they have to be put to death. But that is that those that are sanctified for the upkeep could be redeemed. They should have said about the altar itself. The kachim mizbeach atzman. Ben kachim kalim the kachim kedashim. The Mishnah should have said that kachei kalim, according to Rabbi Yossi, it's only mum and bailim, it's only monies that is connected to the donor, because the donor is going to participate in the consumption of the sacrifice. Whereas the sacrifices that are given over totally to the temple, although it's for your atonement, so you no longer have an ownership in it, and therefore you could redeem it. So why don't we say that clearly in the Brisa? The lemisa azla kadamrin and chamash chatis misas. Then we learn in the Talmud, it's brought down that there's 5 different sin sacrifices that get put to death. There's many scenarios. The sin sacrifice is a very complicated sacrifice. But one of these ideas is that if the donor, the person who gives the sin sacrifices, dies for whatever reason, in our case, the person's dying because he's being put to death. It could be the person dies of natural causes. It makes no difference. If the person's no longer alive, that sacrifice has to be put to death, the sacrifice itself. And therefore, we couldn't make a blanket statement about kachim. Therefore, we couldn't just make a general statement that sanctified sacrifices, meaning that gets totally consumed or eaten by the kohanim only, the Ir Hanidachas yiru, that they should pasture, and then you could sell them let them get a blemish and redeem them. They keep the meisulahem, because the person who's donating these sacrifices are going to be killed. And if one of those sacrifices is a sin sacrifice, that they donated for another sin, right? We're not going into the contradiction of things, of how a person who's part of Ir Hanidachas is donating a sin sacrifice. We live contradictions our whole life. It's not unique to this situation. But if one of these persons that were involved in the Ir Hanidachas, and that person gets put to death for serving idols publicly after warning and witnesses, but also that person also on the side has a sin sacrifice designated for the temple to atone for another sin that they've done. Azle lemisa, the kol chatas shemeisu ba'alei meiseis v'mesechles haris. We learn that any time a chatas, again, not exclusive to our case, but any time a sin sacrifice, the bailim, the person who's giving the sacrifice, dies or is put to death, however that happens, not important, the chatas has to be put to death. Mefarish Taima, and we learn in Haris the reason for this. But Rashi concludes, yes, any other sanctified sacrifices that are not a chatas, a sin sacrifice, Kigoin, for instance, Ashamais is another type. Shemeis Baleim Yiru, then they would be able to pasture and find and get a blemish and be redeemed for value. Okay, so therefore it's just explaining why the Mishnah doesn't say it. Again, this is not an easy Gemara. The end of Sanhedrin is kind of complicated, and again, with a lot of laws that, as if the Gemara is just shooting out laws that we should be familiar with. Okay. The Gemara now continues. Bishleim Rabbi Yochanan. I understand why Rabbi Yochanan says that the reason why we don't redeem sacrifices, and the conclusion of the Gemara is light sacrifices that the owner participates in because it's Zevach Hashem Ta'eva. He has a clear reason. He has a verse that says that a sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination. End the story. We don't want to have anything to do with it, its money, its value. But Reish Lakish, he doesn't say that. Reish Lakish says, "My Tamalam Rabbi Yochanan." Why doesn't he say like Rabbi Yochanan? Why doesn't he just agree? That, and we'll see in the difference what's the practical difference between the two opinions. But why doesn't he say like Rabbi Yochanan, that's an abomination, and therefore any monies that started from a person that's part of this kind of abomination of being a part of a city of sin of idol worship, we don't have anything to do with it, its value or anything. So the Gemara says, he answers. Amar Lach, so Rish Lakish tells you again. We talked about this before. The history of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan was the teacher. Rish Lakish was initially not just a student, but he's a Baal Tshuva. He was a bandit. He was the worst man on the street. He was the mafia, the bandit. I mean, he threatened to molest Rabbi Yochanan in his bad days, and Rabbi Yochanan made him a Baal Tshuva, married him off to his sister. But then they became colleagues in Torah. So we see a little bit of sometimes in their arguments, their past, where they come from, would show up. So Amar Lachzer B'Reish Lakish says, when do we say that the sin of the wicked is an abomination? That's only if the actual donation is in front of us. We're sitting here with an animal that was donated by a wicked person. We're not going to sacrifice it. But in our case, once you're washing it through selling it and using its monies, that's something else. And Rish Lakish doesn't say that the abomination doesn't go that far. That's what he says. So let's see Rashi. Rashi says, the isnu beinayu, the hein atzmem vade einakrivim. Rish Lakish agrees that we definitely don't sacrifice the sacrifice itself, that's donated by a person who was part of a city of idol worship, because it's an abomination. And Rish Lakish says no. There is no abomination because it's not the same money, it's not the animal itself, it's just the value. And the value of the donation, although it was donated by so-and-so, and that's how this whole value was initiated, it means at the end of the day, Rabbi Yochanan has a lot of, it makes sense what he's saying. Rabbi Yochanan is saying, basically, at the end of the day, the bottom line is that in the treasure of the temple now, there's another $100. What's the origin of that $100? You could tell me it came from here, but where did it start from? You have to have something to sell from someone who was an idol worshiper. We don't want to have that value in the temple. End of story. All right. Now we're going to continue. Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon says, Behem Techa. He learns like this, that the Torah says that the animals of a city of idol worship have to be put to death. That we know. But what about, and they get killed with a scythe, with a sword. But we say, it says that, again, you have to remember that when one of the rules of learning Torah is that the sages had tradition. So Olam Sorah wasn't made up ideas, but there's a tradition that you could learn from the words and you could understand how exactly what the Torah is trying to tell you. So the Torah says, Behem Techa, your animal. What does it mean, your animals? What is it coming to exclude? It should just say, Behemas Ha'ir, the animals of the city. V'loi Behemas B'chor Meiser. Now we'll have to see what we're talking about. But Reb Shimon says that if included in the animals of the city, there is the firstborn, which we learned. The firstborn is that it has to be given to the Kohen. Question is, in this case, what firstborn are we talking about? But we'll get there in a second. But in theory, the rule is the firstborn animal gets given to the priest as a part of a tithing, or meiser, or first every one of 10 animals has to be tithed. It gets also sacrificed. The difference is the bechor is eaten by the Kohen. It's money that goes to the Kohen. The meiser belongs to the owner, but the owner sacrifices it, but gets to eat part of it. Part of it goes to the Kohen as any gift, any sacrifice the Kohen participates in it. But most of them. But over here, it's a tithing. It's not a regular animal. So Reb Shimon says that it comes that anything that is a firstborn or part of the tithing animals is not included in when we say that the animals of the city have to be put to death. But now the Gemara says, what are we talking about exactly? At what stage in this animal's life, that is the firstborn or the 10th of tithing, are we talking about? The Gemara asks, what are we talking about? If we're talking about clean animals, meaning complete animals that are qualified to be sacrificed, means they don't have blemishes that are making them disqualified. So obviously, then you don't need the verse behem techa, your animals, to tell us that it's your animals, not the animals of the firstborn of the tithing. Why? Because we learned it from the other verse, part of the verse. It says shalal, the spoils. This is shalal shemayim. This is not your spoils. This is the spoils of heaven. It's qualified for the mizbeach. Ella, we're talking about b'mali mumin. We're talking again. Reb Shimon disagrees with we're going to see that Reb Shimon disagrees with what we learned before about what kind of sacrifices get disqualified. So we must be talking about animals that have been blemished and no longer qualified. So what happens if they're no longer qualified? If they're no longer qualified, so then the Kohen keeps it as just an animal, and so too the owner just keeps it as an animal. So then it says, what do you mean? Shlolaninu, then it is part of the spoils. Once it's disqualified, there's no middle ground over here. If it's qualified for the altar, then it's not part of the spoils of the city. If it's disqualified for the altar, then it just belongs to the owner. In this case, either the owner is the Kohen, or in the 10th or the tithing animals, it belongs to the owner. So it's regular spoils. It's no longer qualified. It's disqualified from the altar, and that's it. It's just like a regular cow. So why wouldn't it be killed like with the rest of the animals? Let's see Rashi. Rashi says, again, there's a lot of information here that's being kind of run through in the Talmud. Maybe we should go slower, but we're going to go a little faster. Hopefully everyone can hold cup, like they say. Not the animals of the firstborn of the tithing. If part of the animals in the city were firstborn animals or part of the tithing animals. Again, the tithing animals is if you have 10 cows, one cow has to be sacrificed, and then the owner eats it, but it's a sacrifice. Shehu shel Yisrael. That means the owner is an Israelite. But nevertheless, the fats and the blood go on the sacrifice. So initially we think that it means to say it doesn't get killed with the rest of the animals because it's not called your animal, it's God's animal. So the Gemara says, one second, if it's talking about qualified animals, that means the animals are not just firstborn or the 10th, but they don't have any blemishes, and you could actually sacrifice that animal on the altar. So we don't need the verse to say behem techa, your animals, not the animals of the firstborn of the tithing. It's not part of the spoils initially. I mean, the Torah first says that the spoils have to be destroyed, but that's only your spoils. So already it's disqualified because it's not even included in the spoils that you exclude it from behem techa. It's excluded initially. It's included to be part of the animal, part of the spoils that gets destroyed. Shal shemayim, it doesn't belong to you; it belongs to heaven. Again, he doesn't agree that it's with what we said in the first part of the brisa, that even the sacrifices are an abomination. Umishla lenafka, we learned that's not yours. Ella, so what are we talking about? Bali moment. We're talking about that they're not qualified for the altar because they're blemished. And therefore they don't go on the altar. They don't have, there's no part that belongs to heaven. Go over as reference to the altar, i.e., goes to God. Whoever's the owner, the Kohen in the case of the firstborn, or the owner, the person who gave the tithing but can't sacrifice it because it's blemished. So it's part of their spoils, and they get destroyed with the rest of the city. So what is the scenario that Reb Shimon's talking about? Ravina says, we're talking about animals that are disqualified because they have blemishes, so we can't sacrifice them. End of story. So they're not. So why are they not? Why are they not considered the owner's money and the owner's spoils? So we don't need. Is mi shenechel b'tayres behem techa. Here, Reb Shimon, according to Ravina, is teaching us a crazy thing. That yes, it's your animal. And yes, it's blemished. There's no part of it that will go on the altar. But it's not your animal 100%. It's your animal. It has a tag to its name. It's your animal that also happens to be a tithing it's just disqualified. Or it's your animal that's a firstborn, so it's not 100% just like you own cows. And therefore, it's not included in the spoils. It has to have the title of just your animal. It can't have a second bite, a second, hyphen firstborn, or hyphen a tithing animal that wasn't qualified. And because it has a second name, although it's not being sacrificed, it's not your animal, and therefore it's not included in the animals that get destroyed. This is the opinion of Reb Shimon. So let's see Rashi. Yes, it's not going to be sacrificed because it's blemished. Nevertheless, doesn't get burnt with the rest of the city spoils. The darshin in the kra hachi, because this is how we understand the verse to teach us. Only animals that are concluded, that are eaten by the owners as 100% your animal. It has no second title. Yatsu Elu, it excludes. Sheyesh Lahem Shem Livoid, it has an extra name. A Livoid means an accompanying name. She'ein Echal B'Taris Behemtam, that doesn't have 100% just your animal. She'ein Omer Behemas Ir Hanidachas El Behemas Bechar or Ma'isa Shel Hanidachas. If someone wanted to say, what is this animal? It's an animal that's mine, but it happens to be a firstborn. And that's not enough. The firstborn excludes it, even though it's not going to be sacrificed on the temple. And Ravina, who understands this is what Reb Shimon means. Again, Reb Shimon is a Tana, meaning one of the Chachamim, one of the rabbis in the times of the Mishnah. And the Ravina and Shmuel are from the Talmud era, which they are trying to understand. Reb Shimon is speaking more cryptic, and the rabbis in the Talmud are trying to. That's why the Mishnah is very small. The Talmud is always trying to explain what did Rebbe mean. When Rebbe wrote it in his times, someone opened the Mishnah, he understood everything. Comes the next generation, the Talmud says, 1 second, hold on, time out. What do these statements mean? So now Ravina and Shmuel are trying to understand Reb Shimon's statement. They didn't live that much. Shmuel is a student of Rebbe. Rebbe was a student of Reb Shimon. We're talking about not even probably 100 years difference, but he's the beginning of the Talmudic era, and he's towards the end of the Mishnah era. Reb Shimon was a student of Rabbi Akiva. Upligi de Shmuel, and Ravina argues in Shmuel. Why? Because Shmuel understands it differently. The Omer Shmuel hakol kariv, bakol nifta. What does that mean? Everything gets sacrificed and everything gets redeemed. That's a very interesting statement. What does that mean? My kamer, hachi kamer. This is what he means. Kol shekariv kishu tam. Anything that gets sacrificed, if it's qualified, tam means it's complete with no blemish. Excuse me, with no blemishes. V'nifta kishu ba'amom, and if it would have a blemish, you can't sacrifice a blemish. So what would you do in just a regular sacrifice? You would redeem it. Mishlal imit. Then the fact that it's not part of the spoils, it's not a spoil, because if this were to be a complete animal, it would go on the sacrifice. It's not part of the spoils. It's just technically not good for the altar because it has a blemish. Then it could be redeemed. The kol shekarv kshutam, the eini nifta kshubamum. What about something that if it's complete, it gets sacrificed? Means if it has no blemishes, it gets sacrificed. But if it has a blemish, you don't have to redeem it. What is the example for that? Firstborn and tithes. Means if you have let's say you have a sacrifice, you donate a shlomim, a peace offering, which you participate in, and something happens, you can't just take the cow and bring it home. You have to redeem its value. But that's not the case in a firstborn. A firstborn, that's why they were very careful with the Kohanim. We learned in the law, I think somewhere in Bechairis, I think in the beginning of Sanhedrin, when we're talking about different who's qualified as different levels of the Sanhedrin, of the judges. One was who could pass judgment on a firstborn. Why? Because the Kohanim are not interested. A Kohen would rather get a goat or a cow firstborn and find out that it has a blemish, and then they don't have. Then it's theirs. Like any cow, they could just sell it. They could cook it. They could do whatever they want. If it's complete and it has no blemish, they have to take it to the temple and they have to sacrifice it. It's a shlep or whatever. They're not interested. So they're very, very suspicious of the Kohanim when they had a firstborn and they came to someone and said, "Oh, I have a blemish." So you have to be very qualified to give a verdict on the blemish. Make sure that the Kohen wasn't, putting glass in his food, God forbid, or putting him to pasture by the thorns, etc. There's all these different shtick that they would do, right? So here we have but if it does get a wound, a blemish, So then there's no, you don't have to redeem it. It belongs to the Kohen. Same thing with the 10th animal, the tithing. If it's qualified, it gets sacrificed. It's not qualified, you just eat it. So mi behema nafka, then you have to learn it from behema. Means if Shmuel, so Shmuel says, and we're going to see the machlokes. Shmuel says that if it's an animal that has to be redeemed if it's not qualified for the altar, then that means it's not called spoils of the city. If it's sacrificed complete, but if it gets a blemish, it's not redeemed, then we learn, and we'll see in what case we learn, then we learn behem techa. Now the question is, a blemished animal that doesn't get redeemed, is it, according to Ravina, because it has an extra name, it doesn't get killed with the rest of the spoils? What does Shmuel hold? So when we see that Shmuel holds, that's the argument. Here again, there's long Rashis, because again, there's a lot of knowledge needed to understand the topics that are in this that are being discussed here. A lot of rules, like the rules of the firstborn, the rules of redemption, the rules of do you have to redeem, etc. All these are like the Gemara is just saying them casually, hoping we have the background information. So Rashi is helping us a bit. So pligi hadir ravina d'shmuel. Now, when they argue, always the question is there an argument? Is there a difference in their argument? Like, what's the difference? How you understand the bottom line? If there's no difference, what's the point of the argument? So we're going to see there's a difference. It means there's a difference halachically. What animals don't get included? So according to Ravina says any animal that has a tag name to it that is not considered behem techa, it's not considered the animals of the city, and doesn't get destroyed. Even if this animal is blemished and can't be sacrificed and would be eaten in theory by the owner if he wasn't killed or she wasn't killed, nevertheless doesn't get destroyed because it has a tag name. Shmuel says that behem techa means to say anything that doesn't get redeemed, we could only learn it for behem techa, but what are we excluding? A complete animal or even a blemished animal? And that's what we're going to see the argument is. Ravina's arguing on Shmuel. The Amar Shmuel says, Allah the Hamil says Rab Shimon. On this that Rab Shimon says, you have a kashle, b'maya skinan, right? When Shmuel also says, what's Rab Shimon talking about? He explained like this. My kamer, what does this mean? Hachi kamer, this is what it means. Kolshu karev legoiva, kishutam, whatever gets sacrificed, when it's complete, it gets put on the altar. It means any animal that's been designated as a sacrifice. And when it's complete, it gets sacrificed. However, kshubamum, when it gets a wound, and this applies to any animal that gets a wound, tzarech b'diyah would need to be redeemed, if that's the case of what we're talking about. You're going shar kachim kalim like any other light sacrifices, a Pesach sacrifice, a peace sacrifice. Like we said, those are called the light sacrifices. So if they're not qualified, what do you do with the animal? So you sell the animal and you redeem it, and then you use the value to buy another animal. But that doesn't apply to the tithing animals. The firstborn. Hanu, those animals, mishlal and afka. So the animals that are not first tithing or first animals, which are the bechor or the 10th tithing. So any other kachei kalim that have to be redeemed if they become disqualified. So that's not considered spoils of the city. The ein machrimim might say that they don't get destroyed ima with the rest of the city. The hayil v'tzrichei pediya b'mama and shalosh shemaim, because the temple still has ownership on it. Why? Because the temple says you can't just use this animal; you have to sell it and use its money for something else. Korean Bay, therefore, it's called spoils of the heaven, spoils of the temple. And obviously, now we see, according to Ravina, he argues on Reb Shimon argues on the Tanakama, on the first part of the Brisa, the Amar Kachim Kalim Am Bailamhu. So they have a fundamental difference, argument. That we learned before in the beginning of our class today, that the opinion of the initial opinion that we learned last week of the Brisa, that the Tanakama means the first opinion, says that any sacrifice that's a light sacrifice, according to Rabbi Yossi, is Mammon Bailam, belongs to the owner. Why? Because the owner has benefit from it. Therefore, we can't redeem it, and it gets destroyed. It doesn't get killed with the rest of the city, but it gets killed in a more respectable way. But you can't keep the animal because it's still part of it still belongs to the person who is being killed. So therefore, kachim kalim, you can't redeem it. But according to Reb Shimon, no. The very fact that the temple demands redemption means to say that it means no one argues about the law of the animal. Everyone agrees. Let's say this wasn't an animal from a city of an idol worshipping city. So if you donate a peace sacrifice, you're just a regular person, not a sinner, not a part of a city of idol worshippers. You just donate a peace sacrifice, and something happens to animals, no longer qualified to go in the temple, according to the technicalities of what's considered a blemish. So even though it's called a light sacrifice because most of the meat goes to the owner, even though it's eaten with a lot of restrictions in a certain amount of time, it has to be eaten in Jerusalem, but still consumed by the owners. So it's called light sacrifices and has less severity, doesn't have to be eaten in the short amount of time. And again, its boundaries are expanded to the whole city of Jerusalem. So it's called Mamim Balim, so then you have to redeem it. But you have to redeem it, and you redeem it, then you have to get another sacrifice. But because you have participation in it, Rabbi Yossi says this is considered still owner monies of the donor, and therefore if that donor happens to be a sinner from the city of idol worship, it's part of his, and and therefore we consider it more his than the temple's. Although everyone agrees it has to be redeemed, but we consider it more his than we consider it the temple's. Reb Shimon says he agrees that it has to be redeemed, and he gets to eat it, and it's called kachim kalim. But the fact that it has to be redeemed means it's more the temple's than it's yours. And that's the argument between Reb Shimon and Tanna Kama. Reb Shimon says, so Reb Shimon says that it's temples, and therefore it doesn't have to be destroyed. Now he continues. The kol shekarv kshutam. However, according to Shmuel, let's say something that gets sacrificed if it's complete, like a bechor, a firstborn, and the 10th tithing. But if it gets a blemish, then it's no longer a sacrifice. There's no laws, there's no requirement of redemption. Then the owners get to eat it as they please. For instance, bechor or meiser, firstborn or the tithings, ahulav shal shemayim. This is not at all considered spoils of heaven because it's not heaven's. Even when it's complete, it's not considered spoils of the city of God. The very fact that it could be eaten with a blemish, it's not considered spoils of heaven, according to Reb Shimon. Therefore, we needed a second verse that says that only your animals, not the animals that can be sacrificed, but this only excludes a firstborn or a tithing animal that's going to be sacrificed actually, that has no blemishes. The mishlala liklamute, we can't exclude it from not being spoils of the heaven. We need a special verse to say behem techa, because at the end of the day it will be sacrificed. And the argument between Shmuel and Ravina is, according to Shmuel, if there is a blemish, he doesn't agree with the tag name. And if there's a blemish and it belongs to the Kohen, and the Kohen is one of the people being killed in the city because of idol worship, or it's a 10th tithing and it belongs to anyone, so that's just a regular animal, and according to Shmuel, that would be killed. So the practical difference between Shmuel and Ravina and the opinion of Reb Shimon is what happens to a firstborn or a 10th animal that is blemished. What would it be killed or not? According to Ravina, it would not be killed with the rest of the spoils of the city. And according to Shmuel, it would be, because that has absolutely nothing to do with heaven, nothing to do with sacrifices. It's not excluded in Behem Techa. It's just a regular animal, and it is included in Behem Techa, actually, and therefore it gets destroyed. Okay, I know this is a lot of ideas. We're going to continue. The Mishnah continues. What about trumais? What about tithings? What do we do with things that are tithings, not animal, like the fruits and vegetables that you give to the Kohen? The first, the 10th. The first is the strum and meiser, right? So Yirakfum, we said that we have to let it spoil. We don't destroy it because it's holy. You can't eat it because it belongs to a person in the city of idol worship. So you just let it spoil. Amar Rav Chisda. So the question is, what happens? Let's say I'm an Israelite, all right? Now I have to give tithings to the priest. You're not allowed to eat from the foods at a certain point until you give the tithings. It disqualifies all the food from being eaten. It's called it's meduma, right? It's this is all holy until you actually separate the tithing and give to the Kohen. Once you separate it, now it becomes chulin. It becomes permissible. So the question is, at what point are we talking about? Is it the tithings that was given to the Kohen, or the tithings that have to be given to the Kohen? It means, are we talking about an Israelite's food that still has not tithed, or we're talking about a Kohen's food that he received as tithings, and he's also going to be killed in the city? So Amar Chizah, we're talking about Truma Biyad Yisrael. That this is the tithing, the Truma that is still in the hands of the Israelite. He hasn't yet, or she hasn't yet given it to the Kohen. But if it's the Kohen's, then the Kohen's given the first tithing, then it becomes his food. It's not holy anymore. No, only he could eat it and all that. But it's his. Tisar if it gets burnt. So according to Rav Chizah starts off saying is that when does the truma have to be let to be wrought is only if it's still in the hands of the Israelite and it hasn't been transferred yet to the Kohen. But once the Kohen takes ownership of it, it's his possessions and it gets destroyed like anything else that he owns. Similar to what we're talking about the firstborn. Truma biyad Yisrael shadayin lo'nitin lakohen. If an Israelite has to give tithings, hasn't yet separated it or given it to the Kohen. Even if this wicked person is evil, and he's going to be killed, and his possessions are going to be destroyed, truma should be yadi and in his trefes. It still doesn't get burnt. The truma, the tithings that is in his hands, won't get burnt with the rest of the city. Imshar shlala, with the rest of the spoils. The halav didehu, it's not his. He's not allowed to eat it. The shema hayyinasin, the kohen tzaddik. What happens if he would give it to a righteous kohen shebechutzala, that's outside the city? Because if it was in the city, he gets destroyed with it doesn't make a difference. But if let's say he decided to give it to in a neighboring city to a righteous kohen, so then why should it be destroyed? Therefore, it doesn't get burned with the rest of the spoils. The hanikipikadin is no different than if, like we said before last week, if you're holding a deposit, if you're holding a collateral of something, of Ir Hanidachas, and you have it. We said in Mutarim, that's you don't have to burn things if someone deposits an article by you and he's not part of the city, it doesn't get burnt with the city. It's not yours. So therefore he says that but nevertheless, you can't eat it because maybe he would just give it to his neighbor Kohen living in the city who's wicked like him. So we don't know who he's going to give it to. So therefore, we say, let's let it yikarvu, let it just spoil. But if you already gave it to a wicked Kohen, if you gave it to a Kohen outside the city, obviously not a problem. But you gave it to a Kohen in the city, and he himself is as wicked as you, then it gets burnt to the rest of the spoils of the city. Okay, that's what Reb Chizah says. Meiser Rav Yosef, again, these are the Talmudic scholars trying to analyze the price. Meiser Rav Yosef asks a question. We learned the continuation of the Braisa is that if you have second tithings, what is second tithings? We learned second tithings is the second tithings belongs to the owner that has to be taken either itself or its value up to the temple and eaten in Jerusalem. Or you have holy articles like mezuzah or kisvei kodesh or tefillin. So what do we do with that? So we said Yiganzu gets hidden, it gets buried. But why are we differentiating? If you're going to Reb Chizda, if you give truma to the kohen, it gets burnt automatically because it's his money. So why doesn't the second tithings get burnt? Second tithings also has to go, belongs to the owner. He eats it. Viktani Yigantu, it doesn't get burnt, it gets buried. So therefore, Reb Chizda, we didn't understand him correctly. So this is what Reb Chizda really said. Reb Chizda says, when does it get rot? When do you let it rot? If you donated the truma to the coin, then it's like the second tithings, and then you can't burn it because it's still holy, and you have to rot it. You can't eat it because it belongs to a wicked person, but it gets buried out of respect of its being tithing. What happens if an Israelite is about to be killed because he's part of a city of idol worship, and all his possessions have to be burnt? But it says, 1 second, before you kill me, I just want to let you know that these 40 apples, I have to give it to a coin. So what do you do with those 40 apples? Why should you bury them? he says, Tinas and the coin should be acheres. We give it to a coin, the Bezdin does whoever. It gets given to a coin in another city. So it gets eaten. But if it's already given to the coin, in a wicked coin, so then it can't be eaten by anyone because it belongs to a wicked coin. And out of respect to it being of its sanctity, we let it rot. Okay. And that's why that to be similar to second tithings that also belongs to the owner, but it doesn't get burnt, it gets buried. We don't say we burn it, even though it's owned by it gets eaten by the owner. Because we're talking about truma that was given to the Kohen. The Kohen's wicked, he's going to be killed. All his other possessions that are private will be destroyed. But the truma that's in his possession, out of respect to it being a holy food, right? The Kohen himself has to eat it in purity, etc. So therefore, out of respect to its sanctity, we don't destroy it, we bury it, we let it rot. The Kohen should be acheres, but if it hasn't been given to anyone yet, and you have tithing, so then just give it to a Kohen of another city. And a Kohen that's not going to be part of the story and also has to be living outside the city, because if he's living in the city, we said even the tzaddikim's possessions get burnt. Okay. Let's continue again. I know maybe some of you are not following, as we're trying to do the best we can under all the details of the laws to move forward. Okay, so he continues like this. He says, Tanan, we learned that Isa Shamaisa Sheni, that dough that belongs to the second tithing. Petur min challah. We don't have to give challah. Challah is we separate part of the bread, the dough, for the coin. But if the dough is dough that's made from the second tithing, the coin doesn't get any part of it. Divrei Meir, that's the opinion of Rameir. The rabbis say no, even though it's second tithing, but still the part that you give to the coin has to go to the coin. Amar Rav Chizr says, Machlekes ma'aseh sheni b'shleim. What are we talking about? Where is this dough? So Reb Chizr says we're talking about that the second tithings already reached Jerusalem. Then now you're in Jerusalem, you're supposed to eat the food, right? You made yourself a dough, you make yourself bread from your vegetations that you brought up to the temple. So you made a dough. What do? You give challah or not? The Rameir Savar, Ma'aser Sheni Mamon Gavayu. At the end of the day, is even though the person is eating it, but it's holy, it's heavenly food, and therefore the Kohen doesn't get it. The Kohen only gets mundane food, chulin. Rabbanan Savar, Mammon had to, even though the owner eats it in Jerusalem, but at the end of the day, the person is a regular person. We don't call it holy food. But if you didn't make the dough yet, but the dough is still in, you didn't go to Jerusalem yet, where it's now permissible for you to eat it. Divrei hakapot you don't have to give because it's not yet, it didn't transition yet from being outside of the cities of Jerusalem to inside the city of Jerusalem. See, Rashi will explain. So Rashi says like this: you can't eat it yet. The second tithings can't be eaten outside Jerusalem, unless you're going to redeem it. Because it's going to be redeemed, and you're not eating it, so then it's considered mamin gavaya. It's considered holy, God's, so to say, food, and therefore you don't have to give tithings of the challah to the coin. Lashon Achar, another explanation is but because you can't eat the bread yet, even though you may not be redeeming it, the hainu b'shas gilgul ha'isa, when you're making the dough, like reading by Reish says arisai seichem, it's not called your dough. Even if you're going to redeem it, patim min challah means the other idea means if you make a dough that hasn't been redeemed yet, even though you plan to redeem it and then take its value up to the temple, but it's not your dough yet, it hasn't been redeemed yet, therefore you don't give challah. Okay. Meisar Rabbi Yosef again asks Ram Chizda. But what does it mean in the brisa? What are we talking about? In the brisa that says, based on this, that we know the laws of the second tithings. What is the case? One case of second tithings or holy things that get buried in a city of idol worship, what's the scenario of these second tithings? If you're talking about seemingly that the city that's going to be destroyed is Jerusalem, because the whole city of Jerusalem served idols. We can't. Why? Because mihavi Ir Hanidachas, you can't make Jerusalem a city of idol worship. It means although it's possible that the city of Jerusalem did serve idols, but doesn't. It's one of the disqualifications. You won't destroy the city. Although unfortunately, in the history of the Jewish people, especially in the first temple, you had situations where there could have been a majority of the people serving idols under the evil kings. But nevertheless, one of the things is that Ir Hanidachas, a city of idol worship, doesn't apply to Jerusalem, because we learned Asar Dvarim Nemar B'Yerushalayim. One of the things he said about Jerusalem, and one of them is, V'zu achas mihen einin nasi Ir Hanidachas. Just the fact. The law is you cannot turn Jerusalem into an Ir Hanidachas. We explained why before, because it doesn't belong to any specific, it belongs to everyone. We're talking about a person. So where's the second tithings? Obviously, the second tithings are not in Jerusalem, and didn't happen from Jerusalem, because the Jerusalem can't turn into a city of idol worship that gets burnt, etc. Doesn't have the laws of that. It means it's not because people won't serve idols, but doesn't get destroyed like other cities would get destroyed. It's talking about another city. And the person brought now, a person, let's say, is part of an idol worship city, and that person is part of the chevra that's going to be destroyed, and he took up or she took up their second tithings to the temple. Hakatlu mechitzes. The rule is that the walls of Jerusalem take possession of any second tithings once it enters the city. Once it enters the city, you can't redeem it anymore. It's been koilet. It's been, what does he say in English over here? It's been admitted by the walls. Once it's been admitted by the walls, why would you have to burn it? It's no longer, it changes its status. So he says, okay, so Yudvarm Nemar B'Yerushalayim Perek Meruva Chashivalu. We learned that 10 things it says about Jerusalem. One of them is that it can't be a city of idol worship that gets destroyed. So we have to be talking about another city, where a person was in another city, had second tithings, and brought it up to Jerusalem. The second tithings belong to someone from one of those people who are part of the city of idol worship. He or she brought it up to Jerusalem before the verdict was passed on the city, because once it's passed, it would be differently. And then the city got considered an idol worship city. And now the question is, what do we do with these second tithings that are already in Jerusalem? Why does it have to be buried? It should be able to be eaten. Once the walls, the cities of Jerusalem, so to say, take possession of the second tithings, it's no longer the city of the Ir Hanidachas no longer trumps the power of Jerusalem. Let's just see what Rabbi Steinzat says. These matters stated with regard to Jerusalem are halachas unique to Jerusalem. Some are rabbinic ordinance instituted to prevent ritual impurity and filth in the city. Others stem from Jerusalem's status as a city that is the property of the entire Jewish people and not a particular tribe. Like I said, that's why it's not an Ir Hanidachas. Because of the status of certain halachot, in other words, the halacha of an idolatrous city are not affected there. Because Jerusalem has its unique status, and one of them is it doesn't belong to any specific tribe. Therefore, even though it is in the tribe of Yehuda and it is in the tribe of Benjamin, nevertheless, it's not considered a city it cannot be a city that has the laws of an Ir Hanidachas. It doesn't get burnt. Its possessions don't get, again, if someone serves idols in Jerusalem, you'll be killed. But you'll be killed as an individual, not as a collective group. But he says, but once the second tithe produce enters within the walls of Jerusalem, it may not be taken out of Jerusalem. Therefore, even if the idolatrous city is near Jerusalem, second tithing produce is not properly gathered into the idolatrous city. He explains why. One of the things says that we brought in the Mishnah, that all the possessions of the city have to be brought to the square of the city. We had the argument of Reb Shimon, I think it was in Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Gamliel, I think in Rabbi Akiva, if you have to build a square if there is no square. But there has to be everything brought into the square. You can't bring it into the square. You can't take it out of Jerusalem. The cities don't let it be taken out. The laws of second tithings don't allow for you to take it out of Jerusalem. And therefore, there's no obligation to burn it. Elalav. So what are we talking about? The Gvulim. We're talking about the second tithings are from a city outside of Jerusalem, and the second tithings are outside Jerusalem. Viktani Gandun, we say it gets buried. So why should it be buried? We'll see Rashi in a second. What's the question? Because before we said that the second tithings belongs to the person that's eating it. So why does it have to be buried? Here we're talking about that it belongs to another city and is brought to Jerusalem. But once it becomes impure, then you could take it, you could redeem it and take it outside the city. And then you would think that you have to redeem it and take it outside the city and bring it to the city of idol worship and burn it. Let's see. Elalav bigvulan v'leimatile v'ktani v'leimatile, and you didn't bring it to Jerusalem. V'ktani yigantu, and we say it has to be buried. V'eni yaitzelis shev bitimia, it doesn't get burnt. Why? V'imi said the bigvulan l'diviharkamam gavaya, and if you're saying that, like we said by dough, what did we say before by dough? That dough that's outside of Jerusalem doesn't have to be given challah because it belongs to God. So why are we burying the second tithing? Why are we even burying it? It shouldn't be. It should be permissible. Lishri nami b'achila, it should be able to be eaten and taken up to Jerusalem. Elalav ma'amin heditu. V'nihid b'sreifa lo mishum zilusa. So why don't we burn it? We don't burn it because we don't want to shame it. But we bury it. So what do we see from here? That dough also should have to be given challah. Again, you have to follow the conversation here of what we're trying to figure out. We're trying to figure out second tithing. We said before the second tithing that there's dough. That if you separate it, that you don't have to give challah if the second tithing has not made it to Jerusalem yet. Why? Because it's God's food. If it's God's food, so why are we burying it? It should be permissible to be eaten somewhere or another once it reaches Jerusalem by someone who inherits from this person, the son of this person. Let's say the son of this person takes his father's second tithings, brings it to Jerusalem and eats it. Why? Because just like you don't have to give challah from it, it shouldn't be burnt. Why is it being buried or burnt? So it says no. Ir Hanidachas. It's second tithing that belonged to a city that's going to be destroyed. And you brought it up to Jerusalem, so now it's permissible. But now you want to say that since the walls grasped it, so therefore, anyways, you can't bring it into the city, so it should be able to be eaten. It became impure. You can't eat it when it's impure. Like it says, I didn't get rid of it when it was impure. Okay. We're going to see in a second that the question is that if we're talking about tamei, so that's why it gets buried anyway. It gets buried in Corinth anyway, even if it didn't belong to an idol worship city. You can't eat second tithings that become impure. You have to keep it pure. It means if you take second tithings and bring it into the house of a dead person, so the second tithings have to be buried. You can't eat it when it's impure. So here, the reason why it gets buried is because it's second tithings that became impure. So the obvious question is, it has nothing to do with the city of idol worship. It has to do with the laws of second tithing that became impure. So he says the Gemara is going to ask that. So v'lifrike, so let him redeem it, keep the money in Jerusalem, and bring the actual fruit back to the city of idol worship. The law is that second tithings that become impure. Even you could redeem it in Jerusalem, although you can't redeem in general second tithings. Means this is the law of second tithings. Second tithings is, let's say you live in Tiberias. Those days, Tiberias to Jerusalem was a long trip. Today, it's a long trip. You don't want to schlep your fruits and vegetables to Tiberias. So you take your fruits and vegetables that are second tithings, you sell them. You get a check or a credit card or money. You put it in your pocket, you travel to Jerusalem. And let's say the $100 you made in selling your second tithings, you have to spend it on eating food in Jerusalem. So you buy yourself a steak, you go out to a restaurant, you have to spend it on certain things. You can't just spend it on anything. But whatever it is you spend it on, you spend it on. So you're kind of redeeming the money and using the money in Jerusalem as second tithings. But the law is, once you come to Jerusalem, you can't just bring your fruits to Jerusalem and sell them and buy something else. You have to eat the fruits. If you bring the apples all the way to Jerusalem, you can't say, okay, I don't want to eat apples. I'm going to sell the apples to someone in Jerusalem and buy with it steak or buy with it oranges. No, once it comes into Jerusalem, you have to eat it. But that's only talking about if it stayed pure. But what happens if it became impure? You can't eat it anyways. So you redeem it and use the money to buy something else in Jerusalem that's pure. So if second tithings become impure once it reaches Jerusalem, you can't eat it. It means you can't. The pasuk really is talking about you can't carry it. That if you can't carry it, then you redeem and get money and take the money to Jerusalem. But se'esai also means you can't eat it. Why can't you eat it? Because it became impure. We see that there's a verse to support that the word carrying also means, in this case, eating. And what would it be? So therefore, it's talking about bilakuach, where it's been purchased, that it's been purchased with, you redeemed it already. Let's say you redeemed the fruits in Tiberias. Tiberias turns into a city of idol worship. You took the money into Jerusalem, so now the money can't be taken out, but you bought something in Jerusalem that is impure. And then you bought something into money, now the money now became pure. Then you can't redeem it a second time, you have to bury it. But again, that's what applies to any second tithes. All right, let's just finish the Rashi here. We're going to try as much as we can to go as far as we can. And we may have to do 2 more classes until we finish. Okay, so he says like this. Rashi says, once it brings to Jerusalem, even though technically we learned that you can't redeem the value only once it's in Jerusalem or close to Jerusalem, only if you can't carry all the fruit. So then the pasuk allows you to redeem it to money or valuables, and then to buy with that money valuables something else. But here we're talking about ein se'es elachila v'achikamer kara that he says that se'es doesn't mean just to carry, it means to eat. So if it's far from you or you can't eat it, then, and because, why wouldn't you be able to eat it if you're in Jerusalem because it became tameh? Then you could redeem it as money. So he says, it's talking about b'lekuach, that you already took it money, and you bought something with the money. Let's say you bought apples. You bought wine or something else, bus or meat. And then the meat becomes impure, the wine becomes impure. So that you bought becomes impure. Everyone agrees you can't redeem it. You can't redeem what you bought with money. It becomes impure, you have to bury it. When Rabbi Lezer says that it's talking about that when you actually brought the second tithing to Jerusalem, and it becomes impure. But if you bring the money and the money you buy something and becomes impure, then it can't be redeemed. All right, just this quickly finish over here. We'll have to start next week from the next page. We have 1 more page left, guys, to the end of Sanhedrin. Second tithing has become impure, is redeemed even in Jerusalem in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Lezer. Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining. Shirky dropped off, but we have 1 more page. I guess we have, 1 or 2 more classes until we finish. We'll figure out how we're going to do the Siyum. For those of us, some of us were there for the entirety of it. But either way, Laila Tov, thank you very much. Thank you for staying with me on this difficult piece of Gemara. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.